Sir Simon Case has spent decades at the heart of the British establishment, in government, our security state and a confidant of the royal family. As a former cabinet secretary, the country's most senior official, there are few others that really know how Britain works. He's seen it from the very centre, at times of peak crisis and political chaos. But now he's free to share his thoughts. And he joins us today for a very special Never Mind the Ballots. Sir Simon Case.
Thank you very much for having me.
There's a feeling out there, and people say it to us all the time. You see it in election results, in readers' letters in The Sun, just to talk to people, that nothing in this country works anymore. Why do you think that voters have that sense that Britain is broken?
I wouldn't necessarily agree that everything in the country is broken. I think there are many reasons for us to still be very proud of our country, and I am very proud of some bits. But I think there is a real sense that politics and the political conversation and how we govern our country hasn't been working for ordinary working people for quite a long time. I think it actually goes back a couple of decades, I would say. I think back to things like the global financial crash, when it became clear that big movements, globalisation, had brought many benefits to us, but actually when it all started to go a bit wrong for the bankers, it actually had to be taxpayers who
picked up the tab.
And, you know, you mentioned it, we've been through many crises recently, and a lot of that has involved government stepping in, and again, taxpayers picking up the tab. So the responsibility that the government had to support people through COVID, supporting people with their energy bills after Putin invaded Ukraine, all of those things come back to falling on taxpayers' shoulders. And I think one of the things that's happening is a lot of people who previously thought that they were relatively well off, maybe in a family, 2 jobs, are starting to feel that they're not so well off after all. That actually the burden of these crises coming through, we have to pay for them in our taxes. Actually, they're not feeling well off like perhaps they once did, and certainly compared perhaps to their parents, they're not feeling like their generation is as well off as it could. And then on top of that, you look at many of our public services and people think, perhaps they're just not as good as they once were.
So I feel it. You can't get a doctor's appointment, the trains don't run on time, the water is full of sewage. From wherever you look at it, that's not necessarily... You've worked for politicians of every shade and hue. This government's come in promising change and found exactly the same problems that previous administrations. I mean, the political class, some may argue, every generation argues, are not as good as the ones before, but it can't be a uniquely political problem. This has got to be a structural issue.
Totally right. There are a number of structural problems that we face in this country that I think to get back where we think we belong as a nation, we will have to address those.
Are we just being starry-eyed about the past, or is it justified?
No, I don't think we're being starry-eyed about the past. I mean, this country has an amazing and great history. There are many things there for us to be proud of. I mean, at the same time, there are many bits of life that are much better. I was thinking about it this morning, about education. Actually, the standard of education that most kids are getting in this country is much better than it was, even, a few generations ago. I think about when I was growing up, my parents, having put my older brother and sister through the local comprehensive school, felt that school had totally failed them. But now, because of sustained sort of political drive through a whole bunch of governments, we've now got things like academy schools in a much better place, so our kids are getting better education than they ever have before. But that's decades of effort to get there. So, but there are structural issues. 2 big things, I think. There are big issues in our economy, which means we're not driving the growth that we want. Our country isn't getting wealthier at the pace or the way that we would like.
Well, debt's going up and spending's going up. And taxes are going up.
This is a really good week to be talking about this. Rachel Reeves has to go to Parliament this week and talk about how she's going to divvy up government spending in this thing called the spending review, which is when she says how over the next 3 years, so basically for most of the time that's left between now and the general election, Rachel Reeves is going to set out how she's going to divvy up the money across government. But one of the problems she's got is that our economy isn't growing fast enough. So,
but that has been a problem since the crash, as we're going back to.
It has been a really big issue that both in the public sector and the private sector, our productivity, basically the amount that we do, the amount that we produce per hour as a nation isn't going up as fast as we would like it to, which means the Chancellor ends up with less money coming into the coffers through taxes, which means you have less money to spend either on public services or, crucially, to give the public a break and reduce their taxes. And you said it, debt. One of the little-known facts, I think, across the country is kind of what's happened to our debt in this country.
100% of GDP as our national debt is now.
The nation's credit card is maxed out.
Yeah.
Before the global financial crash, we had what we call the kind of debt to GDP ratio. Was high 30s, 40% back in 2008. And then Gordon Brown, in response to the global financial crash, had to dip into that. Then we dipped into the debt during COVID and the response to Ukraine, and now we're at 100%. So that Chancellor's got, that you cannot borrow any more money to keep paying for public services. So you've got to put, it's about putting the squeeze on the public services now to get more for our money.
How sustainable is that debt? I mean, they're having the same argument in the United States right now. They're having the same argument in other European countries. You've seen the warning lights on the dashboards in Whitehall. How bad is this? And are our politicians alert to sticking on the economy quite how bad things are, or are they just getting through the short-term gain of another OBR forecast, gives them another £10 billion to play with, and then 6 months later they come back and they do it all again, of having outsourced sort of economic strategy to essentially a quango. They're basically living hand by mouth while the debt mounting goes up, and we're spending more on debt interest than we're spending on kids and bombs.
It is, I think, at the top of a lot of politicians' minds, certainly chancellors through the last Conservative government and now. Actually, if you think back to the 2010 general election.
It was all about the debt.
It was all about the debt. Remember George Osborne standing up saying that we were turning into Greece because of our...
posters of the mum's eyes, dad's hair, Gordon Brown's debt. But what happened? They got into government and thought, oh, hang on, let's just carry on spending, right?
Chancellors and governments have to pay attention to debt because that debt has a real cost. So to actually fund that debt, just like when you're at home, you got your credit card or your mortgage, you have to pay for that debt.
Yeah.
So the debt interest that we're paying on the nation's credit card, if you actually put it out like it was a government department, it would be one of the biggest government departments by spending. So it's taking up huge amounts of our money. It's also there, debt is also there, I think, for rainy day moments, that ability to call on debt. That's
was done.
That's what we've done. And I'm a pessimist about the future, about the global situation, about what's going on in Ukraine, what Putin's going to do next, what the Chinese are going to do next, what the Iranians are doing, what the North Koreans are doing. I think the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and we are going to have to be spending more money on defence, but we may also need those rainy day funds.
So we're not fixing the roof while the sun is, it's not even shining. It's looking pretty grim, but we need to be doing more now.
We should be doing more, but to do more immediately is really difficult because the way to do more is to really radically cut public spending, which we can do.
A Labour government is not going to, even with the majority of 400, is not going to have the political will to do.
So I think they do. I mean, they are taking some tough choices. They talk about this welfare. That's pretty controversial, particularly amongst their own supporters. The winter fuel thing, which has obviously been very difficult for them.
Oh, they've now U-turned
politically. I mean, because it is, difficult. I think they have been willing, but really these things are really tinkering around the edges of these issues. If we don't fix the economy and we don't get growth up, it's really, really difficult to just fix this through public spending. There are definitely things that we need to do in public spending. I think most people watching the show would recognise exactly what you're talking about. Why is it there's too much delay, duplication? One of the things I was always obsessed about was, why aren't we using technology more in public services? We're all spending our life talking about how AI is transforming our lives. We've got to make more of all of that. But it is all about driving the economy fundamentally. It's really important. And that's hard.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the OBR. I think one of the other, I think this is one of the other structural problems that we've got in this country is I think a lot of politicians think they're going to be elected on a platform of change. That's exactly what this
Keir Starmer tried to do it and
what happened. And then you come into power and you realise that over the last, actually probably now about 40 years, it's amazing how much power elected politicians have given away in all sorts of different ways.
Do you? That is a fundamentally tricky thing to change because they're obviously always conscious that 4 years down the right line, they're going to have to be re-elected. In a way, you can hide behind the quangos. The OBR is obviously the one that's becoming most contentious. Labour, obviously, first thing they did when they came into power was strengthen give the OBR even more power. And then 6 months in, they're going, why the hell have we done this? Why the hell have we outsourced these essentially an unelected bureaucrat to mark our homework, bind us in on anything we want to do, and we have to do this merry dance? Surely the time has come to strip that away, right?
So I think I'd probably...
Did you say this? Did you say this when you're on the inside?
I'm not going to go into what I said on the inside, but I'll tell you what I think, and you can draw your own conclusions. You can't have elections where no matter who you vote for, you just keep getting the same answer.
Yes.
So you have to change this question. We have to put... We love to kind of rib and tear strips off our politicians. Actually, I think we go too far on that. These are people who put themselves forward to try and make this country a better place, and they deserve our support for doing it. And what we should be trying to do is make sure that whatever platform they stand on, whoever you vote for, if they come into power, they've got the space to do it. And a lot of that, for me, is about stripping back the powers that have been handed to all sorts of... not all of them are quangos, but all sorts of interest groups, and bring these back into
what we might call
control.
The blob. Do you recognise that?
I used to be in charge of a big bit
of
the
blob. You
blob,
are,
and as you probably know, I hate that phrase because I think it's unbelievably dehumanising.
Yes.
But I do understand
where it's coming from.
That there is this kind of faceless, to many people and many politicians, faceless sort of set of organisations that seems to be holding power, no matter what you want to do. There's a million reasons.
So you think the
why
criticism
you
that
can't
politicians have found is fair, that they come into power? I've heard David Cameron say this, I've heard Boris Johnson say this, I've heard not necessarily Keir Starmer, but certainly people that stand next to him say it, that they're coming in and they're pulling all these levers and they're made of chocolate. And they're made of chocolate.
Yeah, so actually I think Keir Starmer has said it. He's said some brave things actually for a
tepid bath of decline.
For Labour politicians, just like Tony Blair did actually. These are the people who spotted really quickly that the way we govern ourselves isn't right. The OBR is a really interesting one, and this is the lesson for me. The OBR was a Conservative government creation. It was George Osborne.
It was a political tactic to wind up Gordon Brown, though.
Exactly.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
But this is exactly what you do when you're in opposition. As George Osborne was the Shadow Chancellor, you look at what Gordon Brown has done as Chancellor and as Prime Minister, and people say, oh, well, he was fiddling the figures. So we're going to take away this mechanism, this forecasting function that sort of this marks your homework, sets the constraints for how much money you've got. We're going to take that away from politicians and we're going to put that in the hands of
the Resolution Foundation.
Faceless quangocrats. And as you say, Labour government says in opposition after the experiences with Liz Truss, we're going to strengthen the OBR, and then you come to doing your budgets,
just literally binding themselves in
over and over again. Politicians are reacting often to some issue or to some scandal and saying, politicians can't be trusted. We should take more power away from politicians. So you can trust us because we're not going to wield power in the same way as the last lot.
Which is just nonsense.
And that is a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
Because we've got to that point that people are fighting hard to get to the top of the tree, to become Prime Minister, to become Cabinet Ministers, and they come here and they say, holy hell, we've given it all away.
So we've seen it exactly that. You realise that, I think we're speaking to ministers and former ministers and Cabinet Ministers and former Prime Ministers, that you always think that the next room is going to be the room that you're going to be able to make the decision in. As a so you become an MP, you then, you put your tie on, shiny shoes, go to Parliament, realise you're lobby fodder. You become a junior minister and realise you can't do anything unless you're the Cabinet Minister. You become a Cabinet Minister and realise you can't do anything unless you're the Prime Minister. You become the Prime Minister and realise you can't do anything because
I tell you, it's
the Wizard of Oz curtain is empty. They reveal the curtain for the final room, and it
is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. I'm sure he won't mind me telling this story. I remember when I worked for David Cameron. Actually, I worked in Downing Street for him, and each week we used to have actually quite a boring meeting whilst he'd gone off to do PMQs, Prime Minister's Questions. Myself and a few other members of his staff, we'd gather together to look at the weekly diary or the long-range diary. Yeah. And one day, Prime Minister Cameron gone off, he'd forgotten something. So he dashed back and came into, and we used to use his office because he wasn't there for this meeting. He walked into this, the first thing he said is, I knew there was some secret meeting I wasn't invited to as Prime Minister.
You're the ones that actually running the country.
You're the ones that are making all of the decisions. And it's amazing how that feels. So, I used to think, oh gosh, in my last job, you become Cabinet Secretary, you're head of the Civil Service, you're supposedly in charge of an organisation of 500,000 people. I suspect the head of the NHS feels the same. Certainly the head of the Armed Forces feels the same. You think, right, I've got the chance to do something about it. And you come here and you think, where are all those levers? How do I make it happen? And you realise everything is a really long, slow, painful negotiation. And you could be in a rush. You're like, well, hold on a minute. We've got to make some changes fast to how this or that works. And you realise you're spending your time negotiating everything. One of the issues in this country, I think, is that fundamentally, we have a system of government that's developed largely over the last 200 years.
Evolved into this rather than...
It's evolved into what I think of as lowest common denominator political thinking. Everybody has an equal say. You come up with an idea and it gets sandpapered away by all of these, and then it's kind of left with this thing, and you think that doesn't really look a lot like what I originally
Is that a
think.
lack of executive power in this country, though? Because obviously every time any government attempts to change it, they're accused of using Henry VIII powers and consolidating. Tony Blair was always accused of becoming too presidential. But actually, look across the pond, and I think lots of people will see, love him or hate him, loathe him, whatever. Donald Trump came in, he had 200 executive orders ready to go on the table. Yes, it wasn't legislation, but the executive office, the weight of his power behind it, meant that an incoming US government was able to do in 2 hours what would take 10 years in this country. Yeah.
I have been fascinated by Donald Trump version 2.
Yeah.
Trump 47. Of how he's learnt all of the lessons
from the first time
when he found himself being blocked, all of his ideas being sandpapered down and all this sort of stuff. And as you say, like him or loathe him, and there are many things which I think to lots of people in this country look pretty extraordinary. There are some things, though, where people say, well, he's getting stuff done.
Yeah, well, he's come in, as you said, that crucial point of... You can hate him, but you can't dispute the fact he's doing what he said he was going to do in the campaign. And tariffs, shutting down the southern border. Yeah. He is the politician that is getting stuff done.
And I think this is really interesting. And what he's doing is he's doing it in a totally transparent way. I wrote something a long time ago, which nobody ever read, saying, just imagine a Prime Minister sitting in Downing Street, signing the equivalent of presidential executive orders with all of the, with all of the flunkies all around, making kind of media moments and political moments out of signing a bit of paper saying you will do this and not that. It's a really interesting way of telling the country that this is my instruction to the machine. And as you said, he is doing the things that he promised. And of course, that's for people who didn't vote for him, and it turns out quite a lot of people who did vote for him, it's driving them kind of around the bend that he's now doing these things. But But this is what you voted for.
Because presumably everyone across the West has got so used to politicians saying one thing and then doing the exact opposite or being unable to fulfil it. Is there a way we could, in this country, we'll talk about how we fix the problems we've been talking about, is there a way of increasing the power of number 10? Everyone talks about, bringing the Cabinet Office and bits of the Treasury into Downing Street and creating the office of the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But without fundamental reform of our Constitution, I don't think you'd be able to have that level of executive power, because, it took this Prime Minister a Supreme Court ruling to say that a woman couldn't have a penis, for Christ's sake.
This, I think, is at the heart of it. This is incredibly boring and nerdy stuff.
Which is what we were famous here on Sun's Never Mind the Ballots for. We're really getting to the technical detail.
This is about constitutional change. I think most people in this country would think, well, the Prime Minister, big figure, powerful figure. What they probably don't know is that in the legislation, the laws of this land, the role of Prime Minister barely appears.
Yeah, first amongst equals, yeah.
All of the powers that the government have rest in the secretaries of state, individual sort of owners of departments.
With their big seals of office.
Exactly.
They go directly to the king or the queen or now the king and collect them, and that is, they are the king's man.
Yeah. So we have a system of government that says the Prime Minister, she says, sort of first among equals. The Prime Minister is chair of the board.
Right.
The Prime Minister isn't the chief executive. That's how our constitution has developed, is to do everything through consensus, which when you want status quo and you only want tiny nudges on the tiller, that consensus-driven, everybody gets a say and everybody gets to chip away at the idea until everybody's happy with it. That's fine if you want status quo. But if you want real change, that is really difficult to deliver.
But if you go back, I was in shorts at the time, but if you go back to Margaret Thatcher, she was a Prime Minister that wielded extreme executive power, right? And Tony Blair to some degree. Yes, everyone got a say, but I'm not sure those says were listened to.
I think what's really interesting about those legends of Thatcher and Blair, I mean, clearly, I would say 2 of our 3 most consequential post-war Prime Ministers. They got stuff done. What's really interesting, though, is that people tend to think back on Thatcher and Blair.
A bit misty-eyed.
Well, I think it's more that people think about their middle and the end of their term as Prime Minister, and they tend to forget that it took them quite a long time to work out how to get
Blair's
things done.
second term was when,
He said, in his memoirs, he talks openly now about, I wish I'd gone harder. It's really interesting.
The scars on his back. Yeah.
People think about sort of Thatcher and taking on miners, taking on the miners' unions and what have you. And of course, what people forget is the amount of time that she prepared before doing that, and how she strengthened her power just like Blair did. And it's not really strengthening power in any constitutional sense. It's just sheer power of political persona that made people do what they wanted. Because, unlike the President of the United States, the British Prime Minister is incredibly weak, actually. And there are lots of people, including many of my former colleagues and my former academic supervisors and what have you, who, if they heard me saying this, would be throwing things at the screen right now and saying, you're totally wrong, you're a dangerous maniac. But in my view, if we don't address some of these kind of constitutional questions, we won't deliver the change that this country desperately wants, both in terms of how their life works and how the public services work.
And you can see it. Do you see what I'm seeing? Nigel Farage keeps saying there's something happening out there. Do you worry that the actual fabric of this country is starting to fray? The two-party system right now is looking pretty shaky. If there was a general election tomorrow, you'd have the potential of an entirely new political party sweeping through and putting the 400 majority government out, a 400 seat Labour Party out on its ear. Do you think we're yet at that stage? You say you're deeply concerned about if radical change doesn't come. How long have we got?
Not very long at all. I think the internal pressures, as you said, kind of how people feel about whether things are fair.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that. I think fairness is a really kind of important concept
And that
in
kicks
this
into
country.
trust in the government.
I am working, I'm working hard, my family's working hard, one or two jobs or whatever it is. I'm putting my shoulder to the wheel to kind of provide for my family. I'm paying my taxes. What I want is a fair chance at work, and I want fair service, and I want a fair go from what the government's supposed to provide to me, and that kind of contract, I think, is beginning to break in this country.
So you're not surprised to see someone like Nigel Farage capitalise on that, regardless of what he says. He's building that coalition that Boris Johnson nudged towards of disaffiliated working class people in former industrial heartlands, overtaxed people in other parts of the country who feel like they're paying way more than their fair share. Bits of Scotland have been left behind, bits of Wales have been left behind, rural, coastal communities that have been left behind.
Yeah.
If someone, we're slightly blessed in this country, I think, that the far right in this country is a bit of a joke. But you look across the pond to France, to Germany. Could we be seeing? Do you worry we're going to see a similar backlash like that?
I mean, what I worry about most is actually having a properly functioning democracy. I said it before. If you vote for change, you've got to get change, and if people keep voting and they don't get change, they start to wonder, why on earth am I spending my time?
Why am I engaging?
Why am I voting? Why am I engaging? Why am I paying my taxes? So I think it's really important that, as I say, these are conversations that are often going on in very dusty corners of universities and bits of parliament about how power works in this country. But if we don't,
this conversation needs to be had in the open.
And okay, most people are too busy working too hard. They're trying to get their kids to school or pick their kids up from school, or trying to get granny a hospital appointment and whatever, and get them to have these conversations. But these conversations do matter if you want this country to succeed. Actually thinking about who wields power and why. I mean, one thing I do know from 20 odd years in government and spending a lot of time with politicians is I'm no good at political predictions.
Right, I was just about to ask you, what does the world look like in 5 years? So I'll cross that one off.
Because I'll tell you, I'm terrible at it. Whether it's Nigel Farage on reform, and you've talked about the pressures, other political parties in Europe. Actually, I would say Trump himself is a real insurgency.
MAGA is a movement now. It's beyond
insurgency.
One, yeah.
I mean, his Republican Party doesn't look anything like the Republican Party of.
Well, I don't think the Republican Party is ever coming back at this rate.
Well, no. I mean, and it's not that long ago. Do you remember? You remember when George Bush Jr. Was first elected, and people were thinking, crikey, this guy's pretty extreme. There was a lot of commentary in this country about his movement in the Republican Party.
Well, look, I mean, they called George Bush Jr. a Nazi. Mitt Romney was lambasted as a sort of extremist, and he was correct about Russia at the time. I mean, the things he was saying.
Yeah.
Do you think that the debate has been slightly poisoned in that sense? Then?
Yeah. Well. We have to. I mean, the first thing is, one of the most dangerous things in the midst of all of this is that the political conversation gets so heated that that violence and things start to seep in, and that
which we have started to see.
That there are moments in our history where we've had political violence, but that isn't who we've become as a modern nation. And when you start to see people expressing their frustration in that way, we should all stop and listen and think, what is happening? What is going on here?
Something is broken.
Something is happening that we should all pay
Dominic
attention
Cummings, your erstwhile colleague, former Chief of Staff, it's number 10, and all-round...
I never knew what the title was.
All-round upstanding chap. He wrote last week about, in the dark corners of Whitehall, there is a part of the what he describes as the deep state, which I'm sure you will have a much more elegant term for. That are looking
call it the deep state.
All right, the deep state. There are looking at this and looking at the fraying of the social fabrics, and planning and making contingencies for, as you say, political violence. For what happens if this doesn't, if this doesn't simmer down? Is that something you would recognise? And and recommend that yes, they should be doing that because we're heading for breaking point.
Well, I think I mean I'm not in government anymore. Haven't been there for 6 months, so I don't know. Mercifully, I don't know anymore what's going on. But there's quite a few things muddled up in that. So there is a thing which has actually existed since the 1970s, which focuses on civil contingencies. Actually, it all came out of the winter of discontent when nothing worked and everybody thought Britain was broken. So one of the things that happened was the government created a functioning government to think and plan. And
these hopefully weren't the same guys that did the COVID planning, the pandemic planning. Someone get the file marked pandemic. Oh shit, it doesn't exist. Yeah.
So that thing's been around for a long time, and actually probably there are versions of that people will have heard of. So the infamous Cobra. Yeah. That team tends to sort of operate our Cobra machinery. So it is there. In terms of planning for sort of full-scale political breakdown, I don't know whether that is what people
should they be planning
doing.
Are we there yet? How big are the red lights on the dashboard?
For me, look, you should always plan for the worst. I mean, it's like you should plan for full-on nuclear war. You should be planning for these things. But what really needs is everybody who cares about this country, whether you're at home, whether you're in the media, whichever political party you're in, whether you're a public servant, working not in a political role, official role. I mean, you should be caring right now about this and asking yourself the question, what is it I can do? What should I be saying? What should I be doing to try and get this country in the place that we want it to be, which is, where we've all got good jobs and we're getting a fair wage, where we are voting through the ballot box and saying, this is what we want our country to look like, and the people we put in power are able to do it.
We talked about growth, we talked about the structural problems. The other great elephant in the room is immigration.
Yeah.
That is now back top of all.
It's amazing.
Top of all charts that, of one of the number one issues that the public care about, it's immigration. We talked about reform, obviously they are hot on that. We talked about, the budgeting, when everything being seen through a prism of spending £15 billion on asylum hotels, it makes it very hard to then justify cuts elsewhere in the system when the so-called magic money tree is obviously available for that. You were there inside, and I know you don't want to talk about sort of advice you gave or get into it, but talk us through, if you can, what happened. We've heard Boris Johnson's version of events. We've heard Rishi Sunak's version of events. We've heard Priti Patel's version of events that, there was nothing they could do to get inflation down other than open the borders to legal migration from a whole variety of sectors, from abattoir workers to plumbers to care home workers. Was that fair, or in reflection, was that just a panic that has now sort of led to a much, much bigger issue of net migration of 1 million, the so-called Boris wave, people are calling it? Was it necessary, or was it a political decision that's gone wrong?
I think, if I'm honest, I'm not sure people really understood what was happening.
Right.
I think it is one of the kind of consequences, going back on something I said earlier about globalisation, that people didn't really think very hard about. Globalisation was supposed to mean cheaper goods, everybody gets a better job. Actually, lots of businesses, the free flow of money meant that you could start a job here and get money or funding from wherever else. This was all a good thing. And I remember, again, I hope he won't mind me referring to this. I remember a conversation I had with Ed Balls about this in 2016. He was then an ex-politician. He hadn't yet taken up his new life as a media and dancing star. And I remember him saying to me, and I'll never forget the conversation, when he said, this is the thing that none of us thought hard enough about, which was the dark side of globalisation, that this free movement of people around the world as they followed economic opportunity, that this was going to really drive some people round the twist, that it was going to mean that they weren't ready and they weren't accepting. It actually meant their jobs were the ones that got canned, as it was cheaper to produce steel overseas or what have you. And they started to see the influx of people from elsewhere coming into their communities and into the classrooms and into the GP surgeries and sort of saying, hello, what's all this about? And I think nobody was really thinking hard enough about this issue and what immigration meant as an issue.
But post 2016, I mean, immigration was a central tenet of the referendum campaign. But then net migration was bumping around 330,000. I think when the country went to the polls in 2016, it was the liberalisation post 2016 that has got us into this unsustainable situation now.
Just one correction on that is, of course, we knew that net migration was running at about 300,000 then, but that was from outside the EU.
Yeah.
That number doesn't include EU figures.
Right.
So I suspect, I don't know, and it's just suspect, actually it was much higher than that. But we weren't recording because we were part of the EU.
But despite a dramatic fall in EU migration, we can get the graphs out if we want, but despite a dramatic fall in EU migration, and then yes, obviously there's a settled status as well, the numbers did go up dramatically.
So they definitely, immigration from elsewhere went up under the so-called sort of points-based system. And this comes back to, again, the point I think we keep coming back to, which is one of the structural issues here. That because we haven't been, for a whole bunch of reasons, training enough of our own nurses and doctors, we haven't had enough of our own people being skilled up in all sorts of different areas, and we haven't had enough of our own citizens being willing to work in the care system or agriculture, back-breaking work that people do and farms all over this country.
Lots of Eastern Europeans willing to come and do it. And they're actually, people think it's unskilled labour. It's actually, if you ever try it, it's really difficult work. It's really difficult and skilled work that we've got incredibly used to just bringing in labour to do that for us because we don't want to do it, or we've not been training our own people. And there's just not been a big mind sitting in the middle of British politics and British government, I think, for the last 20 years, saying, what is happening here? How are we getting it? You mentioned Priti Patel earlier. She's just one of a number of Home Secretaries that I saw from actually both political parties and actually the Lib Dems from the coalition era, saying our problem in immigration, yes, it's about immigration, but it's as much about our skills and our, they have that sort of eureka moment when they come in and realise.
This is actually about labour market issues.
Yeah.
That is our immigration problem, that we have to keep making exemptions in our immigration rules for X or Y or Z.
For the Treasury, it's cheaper to add a few more professions to the MAC list than skill people up, right?
It's definitely cheaper and it's also quicker.
Yeah.
So, actually...
And it gets the GDPR numbers up, and then it helps the OBR forecast, and then we go round, we go again.
This comes back to, hold on a minute, stop the world spinning, I want to get off. This doesn't make sense. Where is the long-term strategy? I talked about things that go well in this country back at the start, saying that we're not always doing... I spend my life doing doom and gloom. My life is I'm a kind of doom and gloom person. But talk about education, actually. We talked about academies. One of the reasons that's worked is that was a Tony Blair era invention. So it went through his period, and then the Conservative Party carried it going. So for the best part of 30 years
there's been some continuity.
We've had continuity of thinking this is the way to improve basic standards in our classroom, and it's delivered. Now, we haven't had the same on this sort of big question of other skills, and it's fed into immigration. And look, immigration is this kind of thing that drives people nuts. So, apologies for those who are now going to throw rotten fruit at the TV screens or their computers as they read this. Immigration is one of those things that right now it's really difficult to fix with one bullet. I've sat through many, many conversations in government over many years now where it's, we've found the silver bullet. We just need one thing here. We need, one piece of legislation there. Now everyone's talking about leaving the ECHR, which may or may not help. But the one thing I am very sure is it's not going to work alone if that is what the people of this country want. And there are lots of different aspects to this problem. No one person is in control of it. We talked about politicians suddenly thinking I'm in charge of everything. Oh, where are my rubbery levers? Home Secretary, you'd think, surely the Home Secretary's in charge of all this. No. Actually, it turns out that there are lots of other people who have a say in this, including courts, that mean you can't do what you want. So, immigration is to fix immigration is going to require effort on a whole bunch of fronts. We're going to have to do something about labour market and skills in this country. There are lots of things that we need to do through legislation and courts that need to be done. The processing is...
What timescale do you put on this? So, that's the problem, because we're, the strands of what we're talking about today with, you need massive overhaul of the system to get growth going, to liberalise the bureaucracy, to free things up, to work, to give the Prime Minister more powers, to bring all of government and the courts and civil society together on a big discussion about immigration. Yet at the same time, you're saying time's running out and forces of darkness could potentially gather. We're in a bit of a doom loop here, aren't we?
Well, as I said, I'm always somebody who spends my life talking about it. But
how long have we got?
This is the call to arms now, though. I mean, it doesn't matter who's in power right now.
Well, right now it doesn't matter because
happens to be a Labour government.
They're both saying the same thing. We can't do anything, and we need to fix all these problems.
But we should all, we should all shoulder to the wheel right now. The next couple of years, we need to fix these things.
Simon Case, I'm going to go to have some nightmares now, so thank you for that. Mr. Doom and Gloom, former Cabinet Secretary with some pretty chilling warnings there. See you next time.